morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Sistine Chapel, painting the marble floor with splashes of red, blue, and gold. Pope Leo XIV walked slowly down the center aisle, his white robes catching the colored light. At 72 years old, he moved with the careful steps of a man who knew the value of patience. His eyes, though, still sparkled with the curiosity that had defined his time as the head of the Catholic Church. The Sistine Chapel choir was already assembled, 30 men and boys in their formal black and white attire, arranged in neat rows on risers near the famous altar. Their voices echoed off the chapel walls as they warmed up, the sound rising toward Michelangelo's masterpiece ceiling that had watched over countless prayers and performances for centuries. "Good morning." "Your Holiness," called out choir director Antonio Bianchi, a round-faced man with wild gray hair that seemed to defy gravity. He hurried forward to greet the Pope with a respectful bow. "Good morning, Antonio," the Pope replied warmly. "How are the preparations coming along for Easter?" Antonio's face lit up. "Wonderfully. The boys have mastered the Bach piece, and the tenors finally solved that tricky transition in the Mozart. Would you like to hear?" This weekly ritual had become one of Pope Leo's greatest joys since becoming pontiff 3 years ago. Unlike some of his predecessors who focused solely on administrative duties, Leo made time for the arts. Before joining the priesthood in his 20s, he had studied piano and composition, and music remained his most reliable connection to the divine. "I would love nothing more," the Pope said, settling into the wooden chair that had been placed for him in the front row. He nodded encouragingly at the choir members, many of whom he knew by name. Young Thomas, barely 12, gave a shy wave from the back row before his neighbor nudged him to stand up straighter. Antonio raised his hands, and the chapel filled with the pure, clear tones of Panis Angelicus. Pope Leo closed his eyes, letting the familiar Latin words wash over him. "Bread of angels made the bread of men." The ancient text spoke of heaven meeting earth, of the divine becoming accessible to humanity. This to Leo was the essence of faith, not rules or dogma, but moments of transcendence found in beauty. The piece ended, and Pope Leo opened his eyes to offer his applause. "Magnificent," he said. "Truly you all—" The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, interrupting the Pope mid-sentence. All heads turned as a tall figure entered, his footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floor. The man wore a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the colored light rather than reflect it. His silver hair was pulled back in a short ponytail, and his clean-shaven face bore the sharp angles of someone who rarely smiled. Sister Lucia, the Pope's personal assistant, hurried in behind him, her face flushed with distress. "Your Holiness, I'm so sorry for the interruption," she said, slightly out of breath. "This is Victor Petrov. He says he has an appointment." The name registered immediately with Pope Leo. Victor Petrov, the Russian pianist whose recordings had sold millions worldwide, whose concerts sold out in minutes, and whose outspoken criticisms of organized religion had made headlines numerous times. What was he doing here? "I believe there has been some confusion," the Pope said gently. "I don't recall scheduling a meeting." Victor Petrov stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. "The confusion is not yours, Your Holiness," he said in accented English. "I was invited by Father Paolo to discuss a potential collaboration for the Easter festival. He apparently failed to add it to your schedule." His tone suggested that such incompetence was exactly what he expected from the Church. Sister Lucia looked mortified. Father Paolo was new to the Vatican's Cultural Outreach Office and eager to make his mark. Inviting a world-famous musician seemed like a brilliant decision. If you overlooked Petrov's well-documented opinions about religion being the opiate of the masses, and the Catholic Church in particular being an outdated institution, clinging to irrelevant traditions. Pope Leo rose from his chair, extending his hand in welcome despite the awkward circumstances. "Mr. Petrov, what a surprise. Father Paolo certainly has ambitious ideas." His voice carried no hint of the tension that had suddenly filled the chapel. Victor hesitated before shaking the Pope's hand briefly. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "But I was curious. Your predecessor would never have entertained such a meeting." The choir members exchanged glances. Everyone knew that Pope Leo had a different approach than the more traditional Pope Benedict XVII before him. Leo believed in building bridges rather than walls, in dialogue rather than condemnation. Still, inviting someone who had once compared Vatican City to a museum of outdated thinking seemed bold even for him. "Well, since you're here," Pope Leo said, gesturing toward the choir, "you've arrived at a perfect moment. We were just rehearsing for Easter." Victor's eyes swept over the choir with the critical gaze of someone who had spent decades perfecting his art. "I'm familiar with the Easter repertoire. Predictable choices, I imagine. The same pieces performed the same way for hundreds of years." Antonio Bianchi bristled visibly, his cheeks reddening. "Our tradition connects us to generations of faithful who came before us. There is value in continuity, Mr. Petrov." The pianist shrugged. "There is also value in innovation. Without it, art dies." Pope Leo sensed the conversation heading toward dangerous territory. The choir members were shifting uncomfortably, and Sister Lucia looked ready to escort Victor out at the slightest provocation. Instead, the Pope did something unexpected. "Perhaps you would honor us by playing something, Mr. Petrov. The chapel piano is quite excellent, a gift from the Italian president last year." Victor seemed caught off guard by the invitation. He glanced at the grand piano positioned to the side of the choir, its polished surface gleaming in the colored light. "I don't perform on demand, Your Holiness." "Of course not," the Pope replied smoothly. "Consider it an exchange. You've heard our choir. We would be privileged to hear you. Unless you'd prefer to reschedule this meeting properly." It was a graceful challenge, and everyone in the room knew it. Victor's reputation as a musician was matched only by his pride. To refuse now would seem petty. "Very well," he said after a pause. "One piece." As Victor moved to the piano, Pope Leo caught Antonio's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. The choir director's expression suggested he wasn't sure whether to be excited about hearing a world-class pianist or worried about what might happen next. Victor sat at the piano, adjusting the bench with the precision of someone who treated every detail as essential. He placed his long fingers on the keys and remained still for a moment, eyes closed. The chapel fell completely silent. When he began to play, it was not with the thunderous power he was famous for, but with a gentle touch that drew everyone forward in their seats. The piece was Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, a surprising choice from a man known to dismiss religious music as propaganda. Yet there was nothing dismissive in how he played. Each note seemed to float in the air like a prayer. Pope Leo watched Victor's face transform as he played. The hard lines softened. The cool detachment gave way to something that looked almost like peace. The Pope had seen this before in musicians, how they could access a part of themselves through music that remained hidden otherwise. The choir boys watched with wide eyes, some of them likely seeing for the first time how their familiar repertoire could sound in the hands of a master. Even Sister Lucia seemed temporarily forgotten about the awkwardness of the situation. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete stillness before Antonio began to applaud enthusiastically. The choir joined in, their faces alight with genuine appreciation. "Beautiful," Pope Leo said simply. "Thank you." Victor inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to humility he had shown since entering. "The acoustics are better than I expected," he said, which from him was high praise. "Music has always found a home in sacred spaces," the Pope replied. "Perhaps because both seek to express what cannot be captured in ordinary words." Something flickered across Victor's face. Interest, perhaps, or surprise that the Pope would speak this way. "Now that we've broken the ice," Pope Leo continued, "why don't we discuss this potential collaboration Father Paolo mentioned? Antonio, would you and the choir give us a few minutes?" As the choir filed out for their break, Victor remained at the piano, absently playing a few notes. "I should warn you," he said once they were alone, except for Sister Lucia standing discreetly by the door. "I didn't come here because I've had a change of heart about the church. I came because I was curious about you. The newspapers call you the modern Pope, but I wondered if that was just good public relations." Pope Leo smiled. "And what have you concluded from our brief acquaintance?" Victor studied him with sharp eyes. "I haven't decided yet, but I will say this. You didn't have me removed when I arrived unannounced, and you didn't flinch when I played sacred music my way. That suggests you might be more interesting than I expected." The Pope laughed quietly. "Mr. Petrov, I have a feeling our conversations will be anything but boring. Shall we continue them over lunch? The Vatican chef makes an excellent pasta that might convince you God exists after all." Victor's mouth twitched in what might almost have been a smile. "I doubt that, Your Holiness. But I am hungry, and I'm willing to be surprised." As they walked together toward the door, neither man could have predicted how this unlikely meeting would soon shake the foundations of the Vatican and lead to a moment that would leave everyone, including a world-famous pianist, completely speechless. Lunch with Pope Leo XIV, stretched into nearly 3 hours, something that had never happened in Viktor Petrov's experience with public figures. Usually such meetings were carefully timed affairs, 45 minutes of small talk, a photo opportunity, and a swift goodbye. But the Pope seemed genuinely interested in Victor's thoughts on music, asking questions that revealed a surprising depth of knowledge. "You studied at the Moscow Conservatory?" the Pope asked as they finished their coffee in a small private dining room overlooking the Vatican gardens. "Yes." "Under Professor Baranov," Victor replied, surprised the Pope would know of the institution. "He was a terrible man, but a brilliant teacher." The Pope smiled. "The best teachers often are. They push us beyond what we think possible." "Did you have such teachers?" Victor asked, suddenly curious about the man behind the papal robes. A distant look crossed the Pope's face. "I studied piano as a young man. My teacher, Mrs. Lombardi, would rap my knuckles with a ruler when I played without feeling." He laughed softly. "She said technique without heart is just noise." Victor found himself nodding in agreement. It was strange to find common ground with the leader of a faith he had publicly criticized. Before he could respond, Sister Lucia appeared at the doorway. "Your Holiness, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the choir will be resuming their rehearsal soon. And you have that meeting with the Cardinal Secretary of State at 3. Pope Leo nodded. "Thank you, Sister. Mr. Petrov, would you care to join us for the remainder of the rehearsal? I believe they're working on the piece for Good Friday." Victor hesitated. He had planned to return to his hotel after this obligatory meeting, a meeting he had only accepted out of curiosity and because his manager thought a Vatican connection might help soften his public image. But something about the Pope's genuine interest had disarmed him. "Why not?" he said finally. "I'm curious to hear what else your choir has prepared." They returned to the Sistine Chapel to find the choir already assembled. Antonio Bianchi looked surprised to see Victor return with the Pope, but he quickly recovered and gestured for everyone to take their places. "We were about to work on Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus," Antonio explained. "It's a challenging piece, especially for the younger boys." Victor sat in the back row, arms crossed, as the choir began. The piece was indeed difficult, with intricate harmonies that required perfect control. About halfway through, Antonio stopped them, focusing on a section where the tenors and altos seemed to be struggling with the timing. No, Antonio said, frustration evident in his voice. "You're coming in too early. Let's try again from measure 20. They repeated the section 3 times with little improvement. Victor shifted in his seat, clearly itching to say something. Pope Leo noticed and leaned toward him. "You have a thought, Mr. Petrov." Victor hesitated, then spoke up. "The problem isn't timing, it's that they don't understand what they're singing." Antonio turned, his expression a mix of surprise and offense. "I assure you, Mr. Petrov, every member of this choir knows the translation of the Latin text. Knowing words isn't understanding music," Victor replied, standing up. "May I?" Antonio looked to the Pope, who nodded his permission. Victor walked to the front of the choir. "This piece," he said, addressing the singers directly, "is about the moment of transformation. Body into bread, suffering into salvation. Mozart wrote it when he was dying. He knew about transformation." He turned to the pianist, a middle-aged woman who had been accompanying the choir. "May I?" She stood, allowing Victor to take her place. His fingers touched the keys and the chapel filled with sound. He played the troublesome section, but with a subtle difference in emphasis that somehow made the complex harmonies clearer. "When you sing this part," he explained, playing it again, think about change, something difficult becoming something beautiful. Don't count beats. Feel the music breathe. The choir watched, transfixed. Even Antonio seemed to forget his initial irritation, leaning forward to study Victor's interpretation. "Let's try it," Victor suggested, nodding to Antonio to resume his role as conductor. This time, when they reached the difficult section, something shifted. The tenors and altos found their harmony, and the music flowed naturally. By the time they reached the end of the piece, several choir members had tears in their eyes. Moved by their own performance, that was, Antonio began, then seemed at a loss for words. That was how Mozart intended it. Victor completed the thought. You have a fine choir, Director Bianchi. They just needed to connect with the emotion behind the notes. Pope Leo watched this exchange with interest. Victor Petrov was revealing himself to be more than the cynical critic he appeared in public. There was a man who cared deeply about music, perhaps even about its spiritual dimensions, though Victor would likely never admit it. The remainder of the rehearsal took on a different energy, with Victor occasionally offering suggestions that Antonio, overcoming his initial resistance, began to welcome. The choir responded to this collaborative approach with enthusiasm, their performance reaching new heights. As they worked through the Easter repertoire, Victor became increasingly engaged. When they reached a particularly ancient Gregorian chant, however, his enthusiasm waned visibly. This piece feels archaic, he commented during a break, keeping his voice low so only the Pope could hear. The melody is repetitive, the structure rigid. It's like a museum piece rather than living music. Pope Leo considered this criticism thoughtfully. These chants have been sung for over 1,000 years, he replied. There's something powerful about participating in a tradition that connects us to countless generations. But tradition can become a prison, Victor countered. When we perform something exactly the same way for centuries, we stop questioning, stop growing. Art needs to evolve. Their conversation was interrupted as Antonio called the choir back to order. For our final piece today, we'll perform Miserere Me, which, as you know, will be central to our Holy Week services. The famous composition by Allegri began, its haunting harmonies rising toward the chapel ceiling. Victor listened intently, his expression unreadable. The piece was renowned for its difficulty, particularly a high C note that soared above the rest of the music like a soul ascending to heaven. When they reached this moment, however, something went wrong. The young soprano tasked with the high note faltered, his voice cracking. Antonio stopped the music, his face sympathetic but disappointed. It's all right, Thomas, we'll work on it more tomorrow. That's enough for today. As the choir began to disperse, Victor approached the young boy, who looked close to tears with embarrassment. That note is difficult, Victor said, his usual brusqueness softened. Would you like to know a secret about reaching it? Thomas nodded eagerly, wiping away a tear. Victor demonstrated a breathing technique explaining how to support the high note from the diaphragm rather than the throat. Think of the note as already existing in the air, he advised. You're not creating it. You're just giving it a path. Thomas tried again, following Victor's instructions. This time the note emerged clear and pure, filling the chapel. The boy's face lit up with surprise and joy. Well done, Victor said simply. Pope Leo, observing this interaction, felt a growing certainty that Father Paolo's impulsive invitation might have been providential after all. Victor Petrov clearly had much to offer the Vatican choir, if only his skepticism about religion could be reconciled with his evident passion for sacred music. As the rehearsal concluded, Pope Leo approached Victor. You've given us much to think about today, Mr. Petrov. I hope you'll consider Father Paolo's invitation to collaborate on our Easter program. Victor hesitated. I'm not sure my approach would be welcome in such a traditional setting. As you've noticed, I have strong opinions about how music should be performed. Strong opinions often lead to growth, the Pope replied. Would you at least consider composing something new for us? Something that bridges traditional sacred music with contemporary sensibilities? The request clearly surprised Victor. You want me, someone who has publicly questioned the relevance of the Church, to compose for the Vatican? I want the best musician I know to help us reach hearts through music, Pope Leo answered simply. The rest is between you and God. Victor didn't immediately respond, but something in his expression had shifted. The challenge intrigued him, creating sacred music that spoke to modern audiences while honoring tradition. I'll think about it, he said finally. As they parted ways at the entrance to the Vatican, neither man could have predicted the storm that would erupt the very next day, a controversy that would test both the Pope's wisdom and Victor's integrity, leading to a public confrontation that would shock the world and potentially change both men forever. Victor Petrov woke to the insistent buzzing of his phone. Squinting at the bright screen in his darkened hotel room, he saw 27 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Most were from his manager, Natalia, with increasingly urgent subject lines. Call me now, emergency, and finally, what have you done? Confused, Victor sat up and opened his email. The first message contained a link to an article from a major Italian newspaper. The headline made his stomach drop. Famous pianist attacks Pope's musical taste stuck in the Dark Ages. What? Victor muttered, scrolling through the article with growing horror. According to the report, he had publicly criticized Pope Leo XIV during yesterday's choir rehearsal, calling the Vatican's musical traditions outdated and irrelevant. The article quoted him saying things he had never said, or at least not in those exact words or that harsh tone. His phone rang again. Natalia, have you seen it? She demanded without preamble when he answered. Yes, but it's not what happened, Victor replied, rubbing his face. Someone must have overheard parts of our conversation and twisted it. Well, it's everywhere now, Natalia said. CNN, BBC, every major outlet is picking it up. Petrov's Pope is trending online. We need damage control. Victor's mind raced. Yesterday had been unexpected. He had gone to the Vatican prepared to be bored and dismissive, but instead found himself engaged in the most stimulating musical conversation he'd had in years. Yes, he had criticized certain aspects of traditional church music, but it had been part of a thoughtful discussion, not a public attack. I need to clarify this, he said. Agreed, Natalia replied. I'm arranging a press conference for noon. The hotel has offered their conference room. Victor hung up and opened his laptop to see the full scale of the misrepresentation. What he found was worse than he imagined. Social media was ablaze with the story, with people taking sides in a conflict that hadn't actually happened the way they believed. Supporters of the church were calling him arrogant and disrespectful. His own fans were cheering what they saw as his bold stance against religious authority. Neither group understood the nuanced exchange that had actually taken place. One tweet particularly caught his attention. Vatican sources say Pope Leo was deeply hurt by Petrov's harsh criticism. The pontiff has canceled today's public appearances. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Natalia, already dressed in a crisp suit despite the early hour, looking simultaneously worried and exasperated. This is a nightmare, she said, entering his room, but also an opportunity. Your album sales have spiked overnight. Victor frowned. That's not what I want. Not like this. Natalia studied him with surprise. In 15 years as his manager, she had never heard him express concern about public controversy. Usually he seemed to relish it. What happened yesterday? She asked, sitting on the edge of a chair. You were supposed to make a brief appearance, take a photo, and leave. Instead, you spent the whole day there and somehow ended up insulting the Pope. I didn't insult him, Victor insisted. We had a conversation about music. A good conversation. He's knowledgeable, thoughtful. Not at all what I expected. He paused. He asked me to compose something for Easter. Natalia's eyebrows shot up. And you agreed? I said I'd think about it. Well, that's obviously off the table now, she said with a sigh. We need to focus on minimizing the damage. The press conference... I'm not doing it, Victor interrupted. What? Victor, you have to address this, not through the media. They've already distorted everything. He stood up, suddenly decisive. I need to speak directly to the Pope. Natalia looked at him as if he had lost his mind. You can't just call up the Vatican and ask for the Pope. No, Victor agreed, reaching for his phone. But I can call Sister Lucia. The nun who had been present during his visit had given him her card, in case he had any questions about the potential collaboration. It seemed unlikely she would help him now, but he had to try. To his surprise, Sister Lucia answered on the second ring. Mr. Petrov, she said, her voice noticeably cooler than yesterday. I'm afraid His Holiness is not available for... Please, Victor cut in. I need to explain. What's being reported isn't what happened. There was a long pause before Sister Lucia responded. His Holiness is in prayer this morning and cannot be disturbed. Perhaps you should focus on correcting the public record, Mr. Petrov. Before Victor could argue further, she had hung up. Natalia, who had been listening, shook her head. The press conference is our only option. 3 hours later, Victor faced a room packed with journalists. Camera flashes nearly blinded him as he took his seat at the table, a microphone placed before him. Mr. Petrov, "Can you confirm your statements criticizing Pope Leo XIV's musical knowledge?" shouted one reporter before Natalia had even finished her introduction. Victor leaned forward. "I never said what has been reported. My conversation with Pope Leo XIII was private, respectful, and mutually enlightening. He is a man of considerable musical understanding. But you do believe the Church's musical traditions are outdated?" pressed another journalist. Victor hesitated. He did believe that, and he had expressed similar views during his discussion with the Pope. But the context mattered. It had been part of a thoughtful exchange, not the harsh attack described in the media. "I believe all musical traditions should evolve," he said carefully. "That includes sacred music. But evolution doesn't mean rejection of the past. It means building upon it." "So you deny calling the Pope's musical taste stuck in the Dark Ages?" asked a woman from an American network. "Absolutely. Those words never left my mouth." The questions continued for nearly an hour, becoming increasingly pointed. Victor tried to remain measured in his responses, but his frustration grew. The reporters seemed less interested in the truth than in perpetuating the conflict narrative that had already taken hold. Finally, a journalist asked the question Victor had been dreading. "Given your history of criticizing religious institutions, isn't it hypocritical to now claim respect for the Pope?" Victor gripped the edge of the table. "I have criticized institutions, yes. But yesterday I met a person, not an institution. Pope Leo XIV surprised me with his openness, his knowledge, and his willingness to engage with different perspectives. That deserves respect, regardless of my views on religion." As soon as the words left his mouth, Victor knew they would be the headline, not because they were controversial, but because they were sincere, perhaps the most sincere public statement he had made in years. The press conference ended, but the story continued to spread throughout the day. Victor's clarification did little to stem the tide of speculation and commentary. If anything, his measured response only fueled further analysis, with pundits debating whether his softer tone represented genuine regret or calculated damage control. By evening, Victor felt exhausted and trapped in his hotel room. His phone continued to buzz with messages from colleagues, friends, and journalists, seeking exclusive comments. He ignored them all, instead sitting at the hotel's small desk where he had placed sheet music and a pencil. Despite everything, he couldn't stop thinking about the Pope's request. A composition that bridged traditional sacred music with contemporary elements. It was an intriguing challenge. Victor found himself sketching musical phrases, imagining how ancient Gregorian chants might be transformed with modern harmonies. His concentration was broken by a knock at the door. Expecting Natalia again, he was stunned to find a young man in plain clothes who nevertheless had the unmistakable bearing of Vatican security. "Mr. Petrov," the man said quietly, "His Holiness requests your presence at the Vatican tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. A car will collect you at 8:30. Please come alone." Before Victor could respond, the messenger had turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway, sheet music still in hand. Back inside his room, Victor sat on the edge of his bed, mind racing. Was this an opportunity to explain himself properly, or was he being summoned for a formal reprimand? Either way, tomorrow would determine whether the unexpected connection he had felt with Pope Leo XIV could survive the storm of misunderstanding that now surrounded them both. As he returned to his musical sketches, Victor realized something had shifted within him. For the first time in years, he cared deeply about clearing up a misunderstanding, not for his reputation's sake, but because he genuinely valued the good opinion of someone he had expected to dismiss. The Vatican was eerily quiet as Victor followed a silent security guard through corridors he hadn't seen during his previous visit. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating ancient tapestries and artwork that lined the walls. Under normal circumstances, Victor would have paused to admire them, but today his mind was too preoccupied with what lay ahead. They passed through a series of increasingly ornate rooms, each seemingly emptier than the last. Victor wondered if the usual staff and visitors had been cleared away specifically for his arrival, perhaps to avoid any further leaks to the press. Finally, they reached a simple wooden door. The guard knocked gently, then stepped aside. "Enter," came a voice from within. Victor took a deep breath and opened the door. He had expected to find himself in another grand chamber, possibly filled with stern-faced cardinals ready to witness his apology. Instead, he stepped into a modest study. Bookshelves lined the walls and a baby grand piano stood in one corner. Pope Leo XIV sat not on a throne but in a simple armchair beside a window, dressed in his white robes but without the formal accessories of his office. "Mr. Petrov," the Pope said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Thank you for coming." Victor remained standing, suddenly unsure of protocol. "Your Holiness, I want to explain about the news reports." The Pope raised a hand. "Please sit. And yes, we have much to discuss." Victor sat, noticing for the first time that they were not alone. Sister Lucia stood quietly in a corner, her expression unreadable. There was also an older man with wire-rimmed glasses who Victor didn't recognize, seated at a small desk with a notepad. "This is Cardinal Rossi, my private secretary," the Pope explained, following Victor's gaze. "And you remember Sister Lucia?" Victor nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I've asked them to be present as witnesses," the Pope continued. "Given recent events, it seems wise to have others hear our conversation directly, rather than rely on second-hand accounts." "About those accounts," Victor began, leaning forward urgently. "What was reported was not an accurate reflection of our discussion." Pope Leo completed the thought. "Yes, I'm aware." Victor blinked in surprise. "You are?" The Pope smiled slightly. "Mr. Petrov, I may lead an ancient institution, but I'm not naive about how the modern media operates. Controversy generates attention. A renowned pianist with anti-religious views visiting the Vatican was already noteworthy. Add a hint of conflict and it becomes irresistible. But you canceled your public appearances," Victor said, confused. "I read that you were deeply hurt by my criticism." At this, Pope Leo actually chuckled. "I had a scheduled day of prayer and reflection yesterday. It was on my calendar weeks ago." Victor felt a rush of relief, followed quickly by embarrassment. He had spent the entire previous day worrying about something that apparently hadn't even registered as a crisis for the Pope. "Then why am I here?" he asked bluntly. "Two reasons," the Pope replied, rising from his chair and walking to his desk, where he picked up a newspaper. "First, to address this situation together, rather than separately. And second," he paused, turning to face Victor directly, "to discuss the composition I asked you to consider creating for Easter." Victor stared at him. "You still want me to compose for the Vatican? After all this?" "Perhaps even more so now," Pope Leo said. He handed Victor the newspaper, which showed a photograph of yesterday's press conference. The headline read, "Petrov changes tune. Pope deserves respect." "I meant what I said," Victor said quietly, looking at the article. "I believe you did," the Pope replied. "Which is why I think we have an opportunity here." "An opportunity?" Pope Leo returned to his chair. "Mr. Petrov, what happened was unfortunate but not surprising. The relationship between faith and art has always been complex, sometimes contentious, but from that tension can come growth." He gestured toward the piano in the corner. "That instrument has been in this room for over 60 years. 3 popes before me played it. When I became pontiff, some advised me to move it elsewhere to present a more traditional image. I refused." Victor found himself drawn to the instrument. "May I?" he asked. At the Pope's nod, he went to the piano and lifted the lid, running his fingers lightly over the keys. It was a Bosendorfer, beautifully maintained despite its age. He played a few notes, testing its action and tone. "Music has always been my refuge," Pope Leo said, watching him. "Before the priesthood, before all of this, it was how I made sense of the world." Victor turned on the piano bench to face him. "For me as well." "Then perhaps that's where we start," the Pope suggested. "Not with statements to the press or formal clarifications, but with what we both understand." He stood and walked to a shelf, returning with several sheets of yellowed manuscript paper. "These are compositions I wrote as a young man before entering the seminary. Nothing remarkable, but they were honest attempts to express my faith through music." Victor accepted the pages with care, scanning the notations. They were indeed amateur works, but showed genuine musical understanding and an unexpected willingness to experiment with form and harmony. "You were trying to modernize traditional structures," Victor observed. "Genuinely impressed I was," the Pope acknowledged. "Not very successfully, I'm afraid, which is why I recognize the value of what you might create." He sat again, leaning forward. Mr. Petrov, the controversy surrounding our meeting has drawn far more attention than either of us might have wished. But it has also created an opportunity for real dialogue about faith and art. What are you suggesting? Victor asked. A collaboration, Pope Leo replied simply. Not just a commissioned piece, but a public project. You working with our choir, bringing your contemporary perspective to our traditions, demonstrating that faith and artistic innovation are not enemies, but potential partners. Victor felt something stirring within him, the excitement of artistic possibility, mixed with trepidation about stepping into such a public role in a world he had long criticized. It would be controversial, he said cautiously. Most worthwhile things are, the Pope replied with a smile. The question is whether you're willing to risk your reputation as a critic of religion for the sake of creating something truly meaningful. Victor stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Vatican gardens. The world beyond those walls was still buzzing with distorted stories about his supposed attack on the Pope. Taking on this project would mean confronting expectations from both sides, religious traditionalists, suspicious of his intentions, and secular admirers disappointed by his apparent embrace of the Church. I would need complete artistic freedom, he said finally, within the bounds of sacred music. Yes, the Pope agreed. And I wouldn't pretend to have had a religious conversion, Victor added firmly. I would approach this as an artist, not a believer. I would expect nothing else, Pope Leo assured him. Authenticity is essential. Victor turned back to face the room, his decision made. Then I accept. The Pope nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Cardinal Rossi made a note in his book, while Sister Lucia's face showed the faintest hint of a smile. There is one condition, however, Victor added. We need to address the misrepresentations in the media directly. Agreed, the Pope said. Cardinal Rossi has prepared a joint statement clarifying the nature of our conversations and announcing our collaboration. With your approval, we can release it today. The Cardinal handed Victor a draft statement. It was straightforward and honest, acknowledging their differences of perspective while emphasizing mutual respect and shared commitment to musical excellence. It concluded with the announcement of a special Easter composition and performance. This is good, Victor said, genuinely surprised by its directness. The truth usually is, Pope Leo replied. Now shall we discuss your composition? I believe Easter is only 3 weeks away, which doesn't leave much time. For the next 2 hours, they talked music, sacred traditions, contemporary influences, the technical capabilities of the Sistine Choir. Victor found himself sketching ideas on staff paper that Sister Lucia provided, occasionally moving to the piano to demonstrate a phrase or harmony. Throughout their discussion, he was struck by the Pope's willingness to consider bold departures from tradition, balanced by a deep understanding of why those traditions mattered to believers. You surprise me, Your Holiness, Victor admitted as their meeting drew to a close. Most religious leaders I've encountered are primarily concerned with preserving the past. Faith isn't a museum exhibit, Pope Leo replied thoughtfully. It's a living thing. It must speak to each generation in a voice they can hear and understand. He paused. That's what I hope your music will help us do. As Victor prepared to leave, the Pope had one final question. Will you join us for the choir rehearsal tomorrow? I think it would help for you to work directly with the singers as your composition takes shape. Victor nodded. I'd like that. At the door he turned back. What made you trust me with this? Even before the controversy, you hardly knew me. Pope Leo smiled. I saw how you helped young Thomas with that difficult high note. You didn't have to do that. It told me everything I needed to know about what kind of musician and what kind of man you truly are. Victor left the Vatican that morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The project ahead would challenge him artistically and personally, forcing him to reconsider long-held assumptions about the relationship between faith and art. What he didn't yet realize was how deeply it would change him, or that the music he was about to create would lead to a moment that would leave not just the choir, but the entire world speechless. The 3 weeks before Easter passed in a blur of creativity, frustration, and unexpected moments of grace. Victor moved into a small apartment near the Vatican, provided by the church to facilitate his work with the choir. His days fell into a rhythm, mornings composing, afternoons rehearsing with the singers, and evenings discussing progress with Pope Leo over simple meals in the pontiff's private dining room. The joint statement released by the Vatican had caused exactly the stir they'd anticipated. Conservative Catholic publications expressed concern about an avowed skeptic creating sacred music for Easter. Secular music critics questioned whether Victor was compromising his artistic integrity. Social media buzzed with speculation about his true motives. Victor ignored it all, immersing himself completely in the composition. The piece he was creating had evolved from a simple choral arrangement into something more ambitious, a 20-minute sacred cantata for choir, soloists, and chamber orchestra that would serve as the centerpiece of the Easter Sunday service. "You've taken on quite a challenge," Pope Leo observed one evening, looking through the latest revisions to the score. "Are you certain it can be ready in time?" "It has to be," Victor replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "The structure is there now. It's just a matter of refining." The Pope studied him with concern. "You're working too hard. Even God rested on the seventh day." Victor smiled despite his exhaustion. "I'm not God, so I need to work harder." The composition had become more than a professional challenge for Victor. It had become a personal quest. He wanted to create something that honored the sacred traditions of Easter, while speaking in a musical language that felt alive and relevant. Threading that needle required all his skill and sensitivity. Working with the choir presented its own challenges. Some members were initially wary of him, having read about his past criticisms of religious music. Others were simply intimidated by his reputation as a demanding perfectionist. Antonio Bianchi, the choir director, maintained a respectful but cautious distance. Young Thomas, however, had no such reservations. The boy had appointed himself Victor's unofficial assistant, eagerly helping to distribute sheet music and taking detailed notes during rehearsals. His transparent admiration gradually helped break down barriers with the other singers. "How did you become a pianist?" Thomas asked one day as they organized scores during a break. "My grandmother made me practice 4 hours a day," Victor replied. "I hated it at first." "When did you start liking it?" Victor thought for a moment. "When I realized the piano could say things I couldn't express in words." Thomas nodded seriously. "That's how I feel about singing." These simple exchanges, along with the daily immersion in the world of sacred music, began to shift something in Victor. He found himself moved by the texts he was setting to music, ancient words about suffering, redemption, and transcendent joy. Though he didn't share the choir's belief in their literal truth, he recognized their profound human significance. 1 week before Easter, disaster struck. A flu swept through the choir, leaving nearly half the singers unable to perform. Antonio approached Victor after a particularly discouraging rehearsal with the diminished group. "We may need to consider using your composition next year instead," he suggested reluctantly. "With so many voices missing—" "No," Victor interrupted. "We adapt. I'll rework the sections for reduced forces." He spent the entire night rewriting, streamlining parts and redistributing vocal lines to make the piece performable by a smaller ensemble. When he presented the revised score the next morning, even Antonio seemed impressed by his determination. "You care about this more than I expected," the choir director admitted. Victor nodded, surprising himself with his response. "It matters." The final days before Easter brought a new wave of media attention. News that Victor Petrov, the famous critic of religious music, would debut an original sacred composition at the Vatican's Easter service created international interest. Requests for interviews poured in, all of which Victor declined. His focus remained entirely on perfecting the music. The night before Easter, Pope Leo invited him for a final review of the composition. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" the Pope asked as they sat in his study, the completed score open before them. "No," Victor said automatically, then reconsidered. "Yes, actually, but not about the performance itself." "What then?" Victor struggled to articulate the feeling that had been growing in him. "I'm worried that I've created something that's neither one thing nor the other. Not traditional enough for believers, not contemporary enough for others. A compromise that satisfies no one." Pope Leo considered this. The most meaningful art often exists in that tension. It's not a weakness but a strength. He turned a page of the score, pointing to a particular passage. "Here, for example, You've taken a 1,000-year-old chant melody and set it against harmonies that couldn't have been imagined until this century. The friction between them creates something entirely new. Victor nodded, grateful for the understanding. Still, I wonder how it will be received. That's out of our hands, the Pope said simply. All we can do is offer it with sincerity and let it find its own way to people's hearts. As Victor left that night, Pope Leo had one final thought to share. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already accomplished something remarkable. You've reminded us that sacred music isn't a museum. Peace, it's a living tradition that can still speak to the present moment. Easter, morning dawned clear and bright. St. Peter's, square filled with thousands of pilgrims from around the world, joined by curious music lovers drawn by the unprecedented collaboration between the skeptical pianist and the Pope. Inside the basilica, every seat was taken with diplomats, religious leaders, and celebrities among the congregation. Victor waited in a small room off the main altar, listening to the preliminary parts of the service through a speaker. The choir, thankfully recovered from their illness, warmed up quietly nearby. Antonio reviewed last-minute details with the chamber orchestra that would accompany them. Pope Leo stopped by briefly before the service began, dressed in his formal Easter vestments. "Ready?" he asked simply. Victor nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The Pope touched his shoulder gently and moved on to prepare for his entrance. When the moment finally came for the debut of the composition, a hush fell over the basilica. Victor took his place at the conductor's podium. Another break with tradition, as the choir director would normally lead the performance. But both Pope Leo and Antonio had insisted that Victor himself should conduct the premiere of his work. He raised his hands, made eye contact with the singers, and began. The piece opened softly, with male voices intoning an ancient chant melody. Gradually other voices entered, bringing contemporary harmonies that transformed the ancient tune without diminishing its solemnity. The orchestra added subtle colors, supporting rather than dominating the human voices. As the composition progressed, it moved through contrasting sections representing the Easter story, the darkness of crucifixion, the stillness of the tomb, and finally, the joy of resurrection. For this final section, Victor had created something truly innovative, a fusion of traditional alleluias with rhythms and harmonies drawn from global musical traditions, suggesting the universal significance of the Easter message. Young Thomas stepped forward for the climactic solo, his clear voice soaring above the ensemble. The note that had once caused him trouble now rang out pure and confident, filling the vast space of the basilica. Victor, immersed in guiding the performance, was only peripherally aware of the congregation's response. But as the final notes faded into silence, he noticed something strange. Rather than the immediate applause typical at musical performances, the basilica remained completely quiet. For a terrible moment, he thought the piece had failed. Then he turned and saw the faces of the choir. Many had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others looked transformed, as if they had experienced something beyond words. The congregation, too, seemed caught in a moment of collective awe, reluctant to break the silence with something as ordinary as applause. Pope Leo rose from his seat, his own eyes visibly moist. When he finally spoke, his voice carried throughout the basilica. In the beginning was the Word. But sometimes, the Word finds its truest expression beyond language in the universal language of music. Only then did the applause begin, starting slowly and building to a thunderous standing ovation. Victor acknowledged it briefly, then gestured to the choir and orchestra to take their bows. As the service concluded, Victor found himself surrounded by people offering congratulations, cardinals, musicians, even skeptics who had come expecting to criticize. But it was Thomas who gave the response that affected him most. "Your music made me feel like Easter was happening right now," the boy said simply, not just something from history books. Later that day, as the crowds dispersed and the excitement began to fade, Victor found a quiet moment with Pope Leo in the Vatican gardens. "Thank you," the Pope said, "not just for the music, but for your willingness to engage with a tradition you once dismissed." "I still have my doubts," Victor admitted, "about the theological claims." "Of course," Pope Leo nodded. "I wouldn't expect otherwise. But perhaps there are different kinds of truth. The truth of facts, yes, but also the truth of human experience. Your music spoke to that deeper truth today." Victor considered this. "I'm not sure what happens next. I can't exactly go back to criticizing church music after this, the Pope smiled. Perhaps that's a good thing. Not because criticism isn't valuable, it is, but because now you might criticize from a place of engagement rather than dismissal. As they parted ways, Victor realized something had fundamentally changed in him. Not a religious conversion, but something equally profound. A recognition that traditions he had once seen as constraints could also be sources of inspiration. That ancient and modern need not be enemies, and that sometimes the most powerful statements come not from rejection, but from respectful reimagination. His composition would go on to be performed in concert halls and churches around the world, sparking conversations about the evolving role of sacred music in contemporary society. Critics would debate its significance for years to come, but Victor himself would always remember that moment of breathless silence in St. Peter's, when music bridged the gap between skeptic and believer, ancient and modern, and left an entire congregation, choir and pope included, utterly speechless.